There are growing concerns around extortionists targeting construction workers and the recipients of City of Cape Town construction tenders in South Africa. This comes after city official Wendy Kloppers was gunned down on duty at a construction site. Extortionists and the so-called construction mafia operating Cape Town have brought a halt to a number of housing projects in the Western Cape as construction businesses and contractors are being held to ransom. In a January briefing to the Provincial Parliament's Standing Committee on Human Settlements, the city reported that extortion, unlawful occupation, or forceful community disruption of housing units are currently affecting 12 of its housing projects, affecting approximately 4,500 state-subsidized housing beneficiaries. Intimidation tactics have become extremely violent in some cases, with 4 construction staff members shot and incidents of petrol bombing leading to the cancellation of 2 civil contracts worth 140 million rand at the city's Beacon Valley project. In February, 3 contractors were shot at the city's 500 million rand Delft Symphony Way housing project, prompting the city to put up a 100,000 rand reward for information leading to the prosecution of the gunman who fatally shot the official at the housing project. Joining me now is Dion Van Zyl. He's the chairperson for the Western Cape Property Development Forum. Dion, welcome to Business Edge. Thank you so much for joining me.
Good. I'm not sure what time it is with you, but good afternoon from Cape Town.
All right, so we're an hour behind you, so it's still good morning, but we'll take it like that. So interestingly enough, the description of these construction mafias are actually what we know here in Lagos State as something called omonile. It's people who are typically from the communities who feel that they're entitled to some aspect of monetary reward or jobs compensation because of projects that are happening. But this isn't a new issue. So let's go back a little bit. How far back do the issues with the so-called construction mafias really go?
Tulalope, I think before we go into the detail, the term is a very loose term that's used locally to try and describe the impacts on construction sites. This is a problem that originally commenced or originates from KwaZulu-Natal. It then spread to Gauteng, and finally it's come to Cape Town. We've got to give it a context. The context is that the construction industry in South Africa has shrunk by 25% over the last 5 years. So there are thousands and thousands of unemployed construction workers, both labor and artisans not fully occupied. So people are desperate for jobs. But with desperation comes opportunism, criminal opportunism. And what we've seen more lately in South Africa and specifically in Cape Town are some of these criminal elements now presenting themselves as intermediaries. They occupy construction sites under the auspices of unlocking job opportunities for workers, but they will facilitate. And through facilitation, of course, comes the whole corruption aspect as well. So I think we've got to say to each other that firstly, there are many, many people that are desperate to be employed, but unfortunately, criminals have stepped forward and have now put themselves in as the middlemen in the equation. So it is an unfortunate situation. It is something that we've been aware of for some time, but it is finally something that we've got to deal with in the Western Cape.
So it's interesting you talk about sort of the loose term around it. So if we're not calling them construction mafias, and with some of the context you're giving us, what should we be calling them? Because the conversation goes to them being extortionists, using intimidation tactics and even now violence, and being responsible for a fatal killing as well. So what should we be calling them?
Well, the term that locally is also used is business forums or business representative organizations. But I think we've got to keep in the back of our minds that there are 2 distinct parts to this exercise. There are business forums that are actively trying to do the right thing, package labor and skills in a form that it can participate in a very formalized and regulated environment. The construction industry, the contracting components that go into this industry are very formal. But because of the formality, it's very difficult for new entities to come into the industry. You've got to have something called the CIDB rating. You've got to be tax compliant. You've got to be, there are a whole number of hoops you've got to jump through before you can be considered in the formal side of the industry. And let's give credit where it's due. Some of these groupings are really trying to formalize themselves to be able to participate in the industry. But on the other hand, there are these criminal elements that see an opportunity to extort. And therefore, I don't think we should be guilty of using one term, one size fits all. We've got to differentiate between the criminal element and the industry that really wants to formalize, or newcomers in the industry that want to participate. Now, something that we've got to explain as well is in specifically public sector tender work, there is a component of the tender that is allocated towards local procurement. But unfortunately, the emphasis has been on procuring goods locally and not so much on procuring local skills and labor. And again, if you're the middleman on selling goods, well, you end up with a white label situation. You're selling a product which you buy from somebody else. You put a large markup on it, and you present it as local content. Now that's not honest. And that is a loophole that has been created partly because of our public sector contracting and procurement processes. We have less of that problem on the private sector side because, of course, you can choose who you want to contract with to some extent. But I think the emphasis, if we really want to deal with the impasse, the emphasis must move towards local labor content and artisanal content rather than middlemen on selling goods. So we need to look at the contracting component.
Okay.
Having said that, I think there is also a large responsibility on both the development and the construction industry in South Africa to participate in training and upliftment through skills sharing. And that over the last number of years has not been given the attention it deserves.
Okay, so let me ask you, how have construction companies really tried to fight these groups? Because between 2006 and 2019, reports found that construction companies filed more than 51 court interdicts against extortion groups, but those interdicts did really little, very, very little to actually stop the threatening and the extorting of construction businesses. So has there been any real success in sort of fighting against these groups, particularly from the construction contractor end?
Okay, so again, let's remind ourselves that the contractor really comes into the picture in the last 25-30% of the life cycle of a project. The rest of the time is spent on getting statutory approvals. So unfortunately, in the way that we deal with development processes, the contractor really only comes into the picture right at the end. Now, some contractors have really been spending a lot of time and investing a lot of money in setting up community liaison offices to proactively engage communities, identify skills, but many have not. So what you end up with typically is a contractor, and again in the public sector, the problem is they win tenders, but it takes years before they actually get awarded the site and to go onto site. So it's very difficult for contractors to prepare. They don't know who's going to get the job finally, and they effectively get a notice one day and they've got to be on site within 30 days. So it gives them very little lead time to establish a relationship with the local community, to identify skills. So I think there's a fundamental problem in the way that we go through the development process. Now, what we have identified as an organization and really is missing in the process at the moment is the role of the local municipal ward councillor. These are elected politicians on grassroots who should really be acting as the intelligence and identifying possible role players. Again, some contractors who do have the time or regularly work in a certain area do establish relationships over time with ward councillors and other community leaders. But I'm concerned that the problem is lumped with the contractor right at the end of the process, and the client, whether it's being the public sector or the private sector, should be at the table and should be visible right from the start in this process of community engagement. So contractors are trying. Many of them have reverted to appointing very large security companies. Comes at an incredible cost. It is dealing with the symptoms. It is not dealing with the cause. And we as an organization are activating that we've got to deal with the cause.
And that's where I want to go now in terms of the ramifications and the consequences. What's the impact of these criminal activities? So if a construction company has to pay a lot more money for security, who sort of bears that cost? So where does that cost get spread out? It's even reported that some companies are budgeting as much as 30% for these business forums in order to be able to avoid violence, in order for the projects simply to continue. So in terms of the financial ramifications on the construction industry, on individual construction companies, and even then on the economy, what are you seeing?
Well, firstly, I doubt whether people are budgeting 30% because the margins in construction in South Africa is not nearly there. So if they are allocating 30% outwards and not getting fair return on that money, they'll go bankrupt. So I think what one is seeing is a case of there is a security cost. At the moment, contracts don't really allow that cost to be passed to the client. Contractors are assessing their risk. And what we've seen more recently is contractors walk off site. A contractor is not there to sponsor a client or communities or societies. If he or she can't make a profit on the job, they're going to walk off site. And that's not what's starting to happen now. And that's very, very concerning. So one of the aspects that we've also identified is how does the cost of security and community liaison get priced into the bill of quantities right in the beginning? And that currently is missing and it needs to be addressed. But there have been instances where, anecdotally, we've heard contractors paying out cash amounts to try and get rid of the problem. If you do that, the problem doesn't go away. It just gets another face. And we're on record as saying to our membership, for goodness sake, guys, please be wary. Please do not pay off people to just go away. Rather, take the time, buy some time with your clients and get constructive community involvement versus paying bribes.
And that makes a lot of sense because when you pay this one, what we're hearing is that it's another one that comes the next day. It just continues to spread. So Dion, before I let you go very quickly, it seems that so far the government and the police have not been able to get a grip on the rising trend of construction mafias. But government is trying to address the issue and has now drafted policies and legislation to tackle these extortion syndicates. This includes the Critical Infrastructure Protection Act, the National Infrastructure Plan, as well as the Critical Infrastructure Program. Do you think these will address some of the root causes as you've laid out? What really could be done in the long run to fix this issue? You've talked about community liaisons, construction companies having more time to even engage. What do you think about what government is trying?
I'm sorry, I'm smiling because more red tape is not going to solve the problem. Government's go-to place is to create regulation and legislation. What we need in South Africa is for the South African police force to do what it's constitutionally mandated to do, and that is to enforce law and order. It doesn't need another act or another piece of policy or regulation to do its job. The South African police must do its job. Now, there are police officers trying their best, but it needs political support. So the national leadership at a political level must be seen to support the South African police services in doing its constitutional mandated task. I think that is missing at the moment. It is too easy to hide behind more legislation and more regulation. I think that
Dion, are you still with me? Unfortunately, it seems we're having a technical issue with my guest as we're wrapping up this conversation about the impact of construction mafias in Cape Town in South Africa. Dion van Zyl is the chairperson for the Western Cape Property Development Forum. I do believe he's back. Dion, are you back with me?
I am. I don't know what happened there. I think our electrical supply might have interrupted the data.
No problem. So just wrap up your thoughts as we wrap up the conversation.
Sorry, repeat that, Tallulah.
So I said, just go ahead and finish your line of thoughts as we wrap up the conversation. So you said government should stay away from legislation and more red tape in fixing this problem.
Yeah, no, look, to summarize, I think what we're sitting with at the moment is we're sitting with a social and economic crisis, but we're also sitting with a policing crisis. And the South African police force does not require more legislation or regulation as a mandate to do its job. The South African police force is constitutionally mandated to keep law and order. What is missing at the moment is political support for the police to do its job. And I think that's the missing part. Contractors would love to do what they do well, i.e. build things and employ labor, but we need the protection and the support of the national government to mandate the police to provide the necessary security and protection. And I think that's missing. Having said that, there are officers out there that are trying their best. We've had very good engagement with certain role players, but I think it's the exception rather than the norm right now.
All right, Dion, thank you so much. It's an interesting conversation because I think across the continent, there are many communities that can that can see themselves in this conversation. We just have a different name for what we call them, what we call these groups that are coming forward. But it's an interesting one. We'll see how things continue to play out in South Africa and with Cape Town as well. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you, Tallulah.
All right.